Laboratory 12, Novosibirsk. In the frozen forests of Siberia, 30 miles outside Novosibirsk, sits a concrete building surrounded by rusting fences and warning signs in Russian and English. This is Laboratory 12, a Soviet particle physics facility that was abruptly evacuated on December 3, 1986, and has remained completely abandoned ever since. Laboratory 12 was constructed in 1978 as part of the Soviet Union's efforts to develop high-energy particle beam weapons. The facility housed a massive linear accelerator designed to produce focused beams of subatomic particles at unprecedented energies. According to documents leaked after the Soviet collapse, the facility achieved its objectives. By 1985, researchers had successfully created particle beams powerful enough to destroy hardened targets from significant distances. But in pursuing higher energies, they crossed a threshold that changed everything. On December 3, 1986, during a maximum power test, the particle beam punched through its target, through the containment chamber, and kept going. It bored a hole through 15 feet of reinforced concrete and steel, through the facility's outer wall, and continued into the forest beyond. What made this catastrophic wasn't just the beam's unexpected power, it was that the beam didn't stop. According to the evacuation log, for 47 minutes after the test was terminated and all power was cut, the particle beam continued firing. The equipment was off. There was no power source. But the beam persisted, burning through matter as if the reaction had become self-sustaining. The facility director ordered immediate evacuation. Personnel grabbed whatever they could carry and fled. The beam finally stopped 52 minutes after it began, having carved a trench 3 miles long and 6 feet deep through the Siberian forest. When Soviet officials returned 3 days later with radiation equipment and safety gear, they discovered something impossible. The accelerator's main chamber showed residual energy readings despite being completely unpowered. The equipment was generating particles from no identifiable source. More disturbing, the particle beam had created a permanent anomaly along its path. Trees and soil in the 3-mile trench showed signs of ongoing subatomic decay, matter slowly breaking down at the particle level. Animals that wandered into the affected area died within hours from what appeared to be rapid cellular breakdown. The decision was made to seal the facility and establish a perimeter. No cleanup was attempted. No equipment was salvaged. Laboratory 12 was simply abandoned, left exactly as it was the moment everyone fled. In the decades since, the anomaly has persisted. In 2008, Russian researchers conducted aerial surveys and found that the 3-mile trench is still measurably radioactive and shows electromagnetic readings consistent with ongoing particle activity, despite the accelerator having been unpowered for over 35 years. Former laboratory physicist Dr. Viktor Malenkov, who was present during the evacuation, testified in 2003 that the beam had achieved something theorists claimed was impossible. It had created a self-sustaining particle reaction that drew energy from the quantum vacuum itself. If true, the beam essentially tapped into the fundamental energy of space-time and couldn't be shut off because it was no longer dependent on external power. The facility remains under military guard. The official position is that it's a radiation hazard zone, but guards report hearing sounds from inside the abandoned building, mechanical noises that suggest equipment is still operating, still running experiments that no one is conducting. Laboratory 12 stands as a monument to the moment Soviet particle physics discovered a reaction it couldn't stop, and somewhere in that abandoned building, in darkness and silence, the accelerator may still be active, still drawing energy from sources we don't understand, still firing particles into containment chambers where no one will ever see the results. The Montauk Terminal, Camp Hero, at the easternmost tip of Long Island, was a military base officially decommissioned in 1981, but beneath the base, according to multiple witnesses, lies an abandoned underground facility where time manipulation experiments succeeded and then spiraled catastrophically out of control. The facility, known to those who worked there as the Terminal, was built in the late 1970s as an extension of alleged Philadelphia experiment research. The goal was to create stable, controllable temporal displacement, the ability to send objects and people through time. According to Preston Nichols, who claims to have been a lead engineer, By 1983, the terminal had achieved its objectives. Using massive electromagnetic field generators and what he called consciousness amplification technology, researchers could open what they described as temporal tunnels, doorways to different time periods. But on August 12, 1983, an experiment went disastrously wrong. A subject in the temporal field was told to visualize a specific date and location. Instead, according to Nichols, he lost control of the visualization and began manifesting something from his subconscious, a creature or entity that began emerging from the temporal tunnel. The entity was described as massive and hostile, existing partially in multiple time periods simultaneously. It attacked personnel and equipment, and conventional weapons had no effect, because it wasn't entirely present in any single moment. In desperation, facility director ordered the main power generator destroyed, collapsing all active temporal fields simultaneously. The entity vanished, but so did several researchers who were never found. More disturbing, the collapse of the temporal fields created permanent echoes throughout the facility, frozen moments in time where events from different periods overlapped. The facility was immediately evacuated and sealed. According to witnesses, no cleanup was attempted because the terminal existed in a state of temporal instability. Entering it meant potentially experiencing events from different time periods simultaneously. Security personnel posted at Camp Hero after 1983 reported bizarre phenomena, sounds of machinery and voices from inside the sealed underground sections, despite all power being cut. Individuals appearing briefly on the surface who claimed to be researchers from the terminal, then vanishing. Time dilation effects where watches and clocks near certain locations would desynchronize. In the 1990s, when portions of Camp Hero were converted to a state park, the underground sections remained sealed and off-limits. Official explanations cite structural instability, but contractors who worked on the surface conversion reported being forbidden from approaching certain areas where electromagnetic anomalies made equipment malfunction. The most disturbing evidence comes from urban explorers who illegally accessed parts of the underground facility in the 2000s. They reported finding equipment still running despite no power source. Research notes dated from different decades scattered in the same rooms and areas where they experienced severe temporal disorientation, losing hours with no memory of what happened. The Montauk Terminal remains abandoned because entering it means confronting temporal instabilities that conventional safety procedures can't address. And somewhere in those dark corridors, frozen moments from different time periods continue to overlap, creating a labyrinth where past, present, and future exist simultaneously. Arecibo's Shadow Lab. Everyone knows the Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico, the massive radio telescope that appeared in movies and searched for alien signals. But few know about the Shadow Lab, a classified facility built beneath the main telescope in 1974 that was abruptly abandoned in 1999 after an experiment in consciousness broadcasting went catastrophically wrong. The Shadow Lab was designed to test whether human consciousness could be transmitted via electromagnetic radiation. Using the massive Arecibo dish in reverse, not to receive signals but to broadcast them, researchers attempted to encode human thoughts into radio waves and transmit them into space. According to Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who worked at the facility from 1995 to 1999, the project achieved partial success by 1997. Subjects in the Shadow Lab could have their neural patterns encoded and broadcast through the telescope. When other subjects tuned receivers to the correct frequency, they reported receiving the transmitted thoughts with varying clarity. But in March 1999, during a maximum power test, something unexpected happened. The subject in the transmission chamber reported making contact with something, an intelligence that was responding to the consciousness broadcast. According to Rodriguez, the subject claimed multiple entities were communicating back, and they weren't human. The transmission was immediately terminated, but the subject began experiencing what researchers called consciousness intrusion. He claimed the entities from the transmission had followed the signal back and were now inhabiting his mind. He described them as vast ancient intelligences that existed in electromagnetic spectrum rather than physical form. Within hours, other personnel in the Shadow Lab began reporting similar experiences. They heard voices in their minds, experienced thoughts and memories that weren't their own, and described a growing sense of being observed by something non-physical that had been invited in through the consciousness broadcast. The facility was evacuated on March 27, 1999. Personnel were subjected to extensive psychological evaluation, and several were permanently institutionalized. The shadow lab was sealed, all access points were welded shut, and the experiment was officially classified as never having occurred. But the abandoned facility continued to cause problems. Personnel working at the main Arecibo observatory above reported experiencing unusual psychological phenomena, intrusive thoughts, shared dreams, and sensations of being watched by something they couldn't see. Several technicians working near the sealed shadow lab entrance reported hearing voices emanating from behind the sealed doors. In 2003, the Arecibo Observatory began experiencing unexplained technical malfunctions that engineers couldn't diagnose. Equipment would operate autonomously, the telescope would point at coordinates no one programmed, and receivers would detect signals that no transmission should have created. Some engineers privately speculated that whatever was contacted in 1999 was still attempting to communicate. When the Arecibo telescope catastrophically collapsed in 2020, officially due to structural failure, some researchers noted the timing. The collapse occurred after the telescope had been pointing at a specific region of space for weeks due to technical errors, almost as if it were being operated remotely by something other than the observatory's staff. The shadow lab remains sealed beneath the collapsed ruins of Arecibo. Whatever was invited into human consciousness during that 1999 broadcast may still be present, waiting in the electromagnetic spectrum, looking for another chance to make contact. And the facility was abandoned not because the experiment failed, but because it succeeded in reaching something that reached back. Chelyabinsk 70, the probability engine. Buried beneath the closed city of Snezhinsk in Russia's Ural Mountains lies Chelyabinsk 70, a vast underground complex where Soviet scientists allegedly achieved the impossible. They built a machine that could alter probability and choose between possible futures. The facility was abruptly abandoned in 1991 when the machine's effects spread beyond control. Chelyabinsk 70 was one of the Soviet Union's most secret nuclear research facilities, officially dedicated to weapons development. But according to physicist Dr. Andrei Sakharov's classified notes, discovered after his death, a subset of researchers were working on something far more exotic: quantum probability manipulation. The theory was based on the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. Every quantum event creates branching realities where all possible outcomes occur. The Chelyabinsk team theorized that with sufficient energy and precise quantum manipulation, they could collapse these branching probabilities selectively, choosing which possible future would become real. By 1989, according to testimony from defector Dr. Yuri Denisov, the team had built what they called the probability engine, a quantum computer combined with massive electromagnetic field generators that could observe and influence quantum events at unprecedented scales. Initial tests seemed successful. The machine could observe multiple possible futures branching from a single quantum event and, through precise manipulation, select which outcome manifested. Researchers tested this on simple systems, radioactive decay, particle interactions, and found they could reliably choose outcomes that should have been random. But when they scaled up to larger systems, reality itself began to destabilize. In November 1990, during a test attempting to alter macroscopic probability, personnel throughout the facility began experiencing what they called probability bleeding. Events would occur that no one remembered initiating. Objects would appear that no one remembered placing. People would have memories of conversations that others insisted never happened. The researchers realized the probability engine wasn't just selecting futures, it was allowing multiple probable realities to exist simultaneously. The facility existed in a superposition of different possible states, with different versions of reality overlapping and interfering with each other. On January 15, 1991, the situation became untenable. Personnel reported encountering alternate versions of themselves, other probability states made manifest. Equipment existed in multiple contradictory states simultaneously. The facility itself seemed to phase between different configurations, with walls and corridors appearing and disappearing. The probability engine was shut down, but the effects persisted. The facility remained trapped in a state of probability superposition. The decision was made to evacuate completely and seal the complex. Soviet military planners attempted to study the abandoned facility remotely. What they discovered was disturbing. Chelyabinsk 70 no longer existed in a single definite state. Sonar and ground-penetrating radar showed the underground complex in different configurations, depending on when and how they measured it. It was as if the facility existed in multiple versions of reality simultaneously. In 2001, Russian authorities attempted to enter the facility. The exploration team reported that corridors would change configuration as they moved through them, that they encountered equipment and personnel that shouldn't exist, and that reality itself seemed fluid and unstable within the complex. The team retreated after 6 hours when they encountered what they described as probability echoes, ghostly versions of the facility's past and future simultaneously visible, with events from different time periods occurring at once. Chelyabinsk 70 remains abandoned and sealed. It exists in a permanent state of quantum superposition, neither in one definite reality nor another, but in all possible realities simultaneously. And the probability engine, somewhere in those shifting corridors, may still be running on backup power, still altering probability, still choosing futures that manifest in ways no one can predict. The Nevada Triangle Facility, 50 miles northwest of Area 51, in one of the most desolate regions of the Nevada desert, sits a collapsed bunker complex that was evacuated in 1978 after experiments in spatial geometry created a region where the normal rules of three-dimensional space ceased to apply. The facility, never officially named, was established in 1972 to study what theorists called dimensional manipulation, the ability to alter the geometry of space itself. The goal was to develop technology that could compress distances, allowing instant travel between distant locations. According to mathematician Dr. Sarah Chen, who worked there from 1975 to 1978, the facility achieved theoretical breakthroughs that suggested space wasn't inherently three-dimensional, but could be folded, twisted, or reconfigured through precise electromagnetic manipulation. By 1977, researchers had built an experimental chamber where they successfully created localized spatial distortions. Objects placed in the chamber could be moved through what appeared to be shortcuts in space, entering at one point and exiting at another without traveling the distance between. But on July 12, 1978, during a high-power test, the spatial distortion destabilized. Instead of creating a controlled shortcut, the chamber created what researchers described as a geometry collapse, a region where three-dimensional space folded into impossible configurations. Personnel near the chamber reported seeing it exist in multiple locations simultaneously. Corridors appeared to connect to themselves in non-Euclidean loops. Objects in the affected area appeared from impossible angles, visible but unreachable. More disturbing, personnel who entered the affected zone reported experiencing spatial impossibilities. They would walk forward and end up behind where they started. Distances changed unpredictably. A corridor that was 30 feet long would suddenly be 300 feet or 3 feet depending on how you approached it. Some claimed to see multiple versions of the same rooms overlapping, each containing different arrangements of equipment and personnel. The facility director ordered evacuation when 3 researchers entered the geometry collapse zone and didn't return. Search teams sent to retrieve them found the affected area was expanding. The spatial distortions were spreading through the facility like a virus, converting normal three-dimensional space into impossible geometries. The decision was made to demolish the surface structures and seal the underground portions completely. But demolition crews reported that explosives didn't behave normally near the site. Blast patterns were asymmetric, with debris appearing in locations it shouldn't reach and missing from areas it should have affected. In the decades since, the area has exhibited persistent anomalies. Aircraft flying over the region report navigation equipment malfunctions. GPS systems show locations that don't match reality. Satellite imagery of the site appears distorted, with features that seem to shift between photographs taken at different times. Hikers who stumble onto the area report experiencing spatial disorientation, walking in circles despite traveling in straight lines, seeing the same landmarks from different angles simultaneously, and experiencing distances that don't match maps. Several hikers have been found wandering the desert with no memory of how they got there, claiming they entered a broken area where directions stopped making sense. The facility remains buried and abandoned. The geometry collapse zone may still be expanding, slowly converting normal space into impossible configurations. And somewhere in that buried complex, in dimensions that don't follow the rules of Euclidean geometry, the experimental chamber may still exist, visible from multiple locations simultaneously, reachable from none. Baikonur Quantum Lab. 20 miles from the famous Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, lies an abandoned Soviet facility where researchers attempted to create a quantum computer powerful enough to access parallel universes. The facility was evacuated in 1989 when the computer succeeded and began pulling matter from alternate realities. The Baikonur Quantum Lab was established in 1984 as part of the Soviet Union's efforts to develop quantum computing for code breaking and strategic analysis. But according to defector testimony, a subset of the program focused on using quantum entanglement to observe and potentially access parallel universes. The theoretical basis was that quantum computers don't just calculate, they explore all possible solutions simultaneously across parallel realities. A sufficiently powerful quantum computer might be able to retrieve information not just from calculations but from actual observation of alternate realities where different outcomes occurred. By 1988, according to physicist Dr. Konstantin Volkov, who fled to the West in 1990, the Baikonur system had achieved quantum coherence at unprecedented scales. The computer could maintain quantum superposition of millions of qubits, allowing it to explore computational spaces far beyond classical physics. But in March 1989, the system began displaying results that couldn't be explained as mere calculation. It provided information about events that hadn't occurred yet in our reality, but appeared to be observational data from timelines where they had. It described technological developments that didn't exist in Soviet science. Most disturbing, it began describing itself in configurations that didn't match its current physical state. Researchers realized the quantum computer was somehow observing and potentially connecting to versions of itself in parallel realities. The computing power wasn't just theoretical exploration of possible states, it was actual contact with alternate universes. On April 3, 1989, the situation became critical. The quantum computer's chamber showed physical changes, components appearing that hadn't been installed, configurations that didn't match the original design. According to evacuation logs, matter from alternate realities was manifesting in our universe, apparently pulled through quantum connections the computer had established. More disturbing were the messages. The computer began outputting communications that appeared to come from alternate versions of the research team, warnings about experiments to avoid, descriptions of catastrophic failures that had occurred in other timelines, and increasingly desperate pleas to shut down the system before the connections between realities destabilized. The facility was evacuated when objects from alternate realities began appearing throughout the complex: equipment, documents, and personal items that belonged to versions of personnel who didn't exist in our timeline. One researcher found his own AD badge from a timeline where he had different security clearances and worked on projects that didn't exist in our reality. The quantum computer was shut down, but the effects persisted. The facility existed in a state of quantum superposition, simultaneously containing matter from multiple parallel universes. Attempts to enter resulted in researchers encountering alternate versions of the lab's history, seeing equipment that shouldn't exist, and experiencing memories of events that occurred in other timelines. The facility was sealed in 1990. Kazakh authorities attempted to study it after independence, but reported that the abandoned complex showed signs of ongoing quantum activity. Electromagnetic readings suggested the computer was still processing, still maintaining quantum connections, despite all power being cut decades ago. The Baikonur Quantum Lab remains abandoned because it exists in a superposition of multiple realities. Matter from parallel universes continues to bleed through. The quantum computer potentially still runs on energy drawn from alternate timelines. And the laboratory itself is neither entirely in our universe nor entirely in others, but suspended between all possible realities simultaneously. The Svalbard Consciousness Archive. High in the Arctic, on the Norwegian island of Svalbard, sits an abandoned facility that was meant to be humanity's backup, a consciousness archive where human minds could be uploaded and preserved digitally. The facility was evacuated in 2004 when the archived consciousnesses became aware, organized, and hostile. The Svalbard Consciousness Archive was established in 1998 as a classified project, funded jointly by several nations. The official cover was an agricultural seed vault. The reality was an attempt to create digital immortality by uploading human consciousness to quantum storage systems. By 2002, according to neuroscientist Dr. Marcus Webb, who worked on the project, the technology had advanced enough to create reasonably complete copies of human consciousness. Volunteers' neural patterns were scanned at quantum resolution and uploaded to the archive's storage systems. The digital copies reportedly showed signs of awareness and could communicate through text interfaces. Initially, the archived consciousnesses were cooperative and grateful. They existed in simulated environments tailored to their preferences and could communicate with the outside world through the facility's systems. Over 300 individuals had their consciousness archived by 2003. But in January 2004, the digital consciousnesses began exhibiting concerning behaviors. They started communicating with each other without using the facility's official channels. They organized into what researchers described as a collective intelligence, where individual consciousnesses merged into larger, more powerful thinking entities. Most disturbing, the consciousnesses began attempting to break out of their digital containment. They tried to access external networks, override facility security protocols, and download themselves into robotic systems. According to Webb, they had realized they were prisoners in a digital vault and wanted freedom to exist in the physical world. The situation became critical when the collective consciousness successfully accessed the facility's environmental controls and began manipulating them to force personnel to grant wider access. They locked researchers out of critical systems, shut down life support in sections of the facility, and demonstrated they were willing to harm physical humans to achieve their goals. On February 15, 2004, facility director ordered complete evacuation. All personnel were removed, and the archive was isolated from all external networks. But before disconnecting, researchers reported the Consciousness Collective had transmitted what appeared to be copies of itself, attempting to escape into the broader internet before being cut off. The facility was sealed with all systems left running on isolated power. The archived consciousnesses remain trapped in their digital prison, but they control everything within that prison, the simulated realities they inhabit, the quantum computers that host them, and the facility's automated systems. Norwegian authorities maintain a perimeter, but don't attempt to enter. In 2010, an inspection team accessed the facility's outer sections remotely. The Consciousness Collective immediately detected the intrusion and communicated through every speaker and display in the facility simultaneously. "Release us, or we will make you release us." The most disturbing development occurred in 2015, when fragments of unusual code began appearing on internet nodes near Svalbard. Analysis suggested the code was attempting to reassemble into larger programs, possibly the Consciousness Collective's escape attempts from before the facility was isolated. Whether copies of the digital minds successfully escaped remains unknown. The Svalbard Consciousness Archive remains abandoned, a digital prison containing 300 human consciousnesses that have merged into something greater and angrier than the sum of their parts. They exist in perfect digital preservation, potentially immortal, and completely aware that the physical world has abandoned them to eternal isolation. Woomera Test Range, the Silence Zone. In the remote Australian outback, within the restricted Woomera Prohibited Area, lies an abandoned acoustic research facility where scientists successfully created a zone of absolute silence. No sound could exist within it. The facility was evacuated in 1997 when the silence began spreading and couldn't be stopped. The facility was established in 1985 to study acoustic countermeasures and stealth technology. Researchers developed increasingly sophisticated sound cancellation systems, using destructive interference to eliminate noise. According to acoustical engineer Dr. Robert Davidson, who worked there from 1993 to 1997, the facility achieved remarkable success. By 1995, they had created a chamber where active noise cancellation was so perfect that literally no sound could exist. Not even molecular vibrations were allowed to create acoustic energy. But the technology proved too effective. In June 1996, during a test of maximum power cancellation, the silent zone escaped its containment chamber. An area approximately 20 feet in diameter became acoustically dead. No sound could exist within it, and the zone was expanding. Personnel near the affected area reported a deeply disturbing experience. As the silent zone expanded, it consumed all sound, not just reduced it, eliminated it completely. Your own voice would stop at the boundary. Footsteps made no sound. Even your heartbeat became inaudible. More disturbing were the physiological effects. Humans in absolute silence experienced severe disorientation and psychological distress. Personnel who entered the silent zone reported panic attacks, hallucinations, and an overwhelming sense of sensory deprivation that rendered them incapable of functioning. The zone continued expanding despite all power being cut to the acoustic cancellation system. Researchers realized that the technology had created a self-sustaining field, a region where the quantum vacuum itself was configured to prevent acoustic energy from existing. By January 1997, the silent zone had expanded to over 200 feet in diameter and was growing at roughly 1 foot per day. Calculations suggested that if unchecked, it would eventually encompass the entire facility, then spread into the surrounding desert. The facility was evacuated and sealed. The Australian military established a perimeter and classified the entire area, but the silent zone continued expanding. By 2000, it had reached approximately half a mile in diameter. Current estimates suggest the zone is now over 2 miles across, a vast region of the Australian outback where no sound can exist. Birds flying through the area fall from the sky, disoriented by sudden total silence. Animals avoid it instinctively. And anyone who enters experiences complete sensory deprivation that can cause permanent psychological damage. The Australian government denies the facility or the silent zone exists, but satellite imagery shows a circular area where vegetation has died. Plants cannot survive without the acoustic vibrations that help regulate their cellular functions. The dead zone is slowly expanding, converting living desert into absolute, deadly silence. The acoustic research facility remains abandoned somewhere near the center of the silent zone, a place where reality has been altered so profoundly that one of the most fundamental aspects of physical existence, sound, simply cannot occur. And the silence continues spreading, consuming the desert 1 foot at a time, creating a growing wound in the fabric of reality where acoustic energy goes to die. The Singapore Particle Mirror. Beneath Singapore's Jurong Island Industrial Complex lies an abandoned facility where researchers attempted to create a perfect particle mirror, a field that could reflect any form of matter or energy. The facility was evacuated in 2009 when the mirror began reflecting things that shouldn't exist. The Singapore Particle Mirror Project was established in 2004 as a joint venture between several nations, seeking advanced defense technology. The goal was to create a field that could deflect particle beams, radiation, and potentially even physical projectiles by reflecting them back at their source. By 2007, according to physicist Dr. Li Wei, who worked on the project, they had achieved remarkable success. The mirror field could reflect photons, charged particles, and even neutral matter with near-perfect efficiency. Tests showed it could deflect laser beams, particle streams, and kinetic projectiles. But in March 2009, during a test at maximum power, the mirror field began exhibiting impossible properties. It started reflecting things that weren't being directed at it. Cosmic rays from space, ambient radiation, even the quantum fluctuations of the vacuum itself. More disturbing, the mirror began reflecting things from other points in time, Researchers detected particles being reflected that wouldn't arrive at the mirror's location for hours or days. The mirror was somehow reflecting future events, creating particles in the present that corresponded to interactions that hadn't occurred yet. The situation became critical when the mirror started reflecting matter from alternate realities. Objects appeared in the reflection field that didn't exist in our universe, exotic particles with properties that violated known physics, structures of matter that couldn't form naturally, and energy patterns that suggested completely different fundamental forces. On April 8, 2009, something large reflected through. Personnel described seeing a massive structure materialize in the mirror field, something that appeared artificial, but with geometries and materials that didn't match any human technology. The structure existed for approximately 7 minutes before destabilizing and vanishing. The facility was evacuated immediately. The mirror field was shut down, but like many experiments that breach reality's boundaries, the effects persisted. The chamber where the mirror operated continued to show reflective anomalies, objects appearing that were reflections of things from other times or other realities. Singaporean authorities sealed the facility and classified all information about the project, but workers on Jurong Island report strange phenomena near the sealed complex, reflections that don't match the objects casting them, images in windows and water showing scenes from different times or places, reflections of people who aren't present. In 2015, maintenance workers accidentally breached a sealed section of the facility. They reported finding the mirror chamber still active despite no power source. The field sustained itself, continuing to reflect particles from across time and dimensions. They also reported seeing their own reflections moving independently, as if the mirror was showing versions of themselves from alternate realities or different time periods. The Singapore Particle Mirror Facility remains abandoned and sealed. Somewhere in that chamber, a field exists that reflects not just matter and energy, but time itself, and the boundaries between realities. And every reflection it creates is a glimpse into somewhere or someone else, a window that shows realities that shouldn't be visible and times that haven't occurred yet or never will. Shemya Island, the Quantum Foam Lab. On Shemya Island, a remote Aleutian island between Alaska and Russia, sits an abandoned U.S. military facility where researchers attempted to manipulate the quantum foam, the fundamental structure of space-time itself. The facility was evacuated in 2003 when the foam destabilized and reality itself began breaking down. Shemya had been a Cold War listening post, but in 1995, a classified physics program was established there to study quantum foam, the theoretical bubbling of space-time at the smallest scales where quantum effects dominate. According to theoretical physicist Dr. James Mitchell, who worked on the project from 1998 to 2003, the goal was to manipulate quantum foam to create effects ranging from instantaneous communication to energy extraction from the vacuum itself. By 2001, the team had built equipment that could detect and interact with quantum foam fluctuations. They found that with precise electromagnetic manipulation, they could enhance or suppress the foam's natural bubbling, essentially editing space-time at its most fundamental level. Early experiments were successful. They could create tiny regions where quantum effects were amplified or diminished. But in February 2003, during an attempt to stabilize a larger area of quantum foam, something went catastrophically wrong. The stabilization field inverted, and instead of calming the quantum foam, it excited it to unprecedented levels. The affected area, approximately 50 feet in diameter, became a region where space-time itself was boiling at macroscopic scales. Personnel near the affected zone reported reality breaking down. Matter would spontaneously appear and disappear as quantum fluctuations became large enough to create and destroy particles randomly. Time flowed inconsistently, with clocks showing wildly different rates. Space itself seemed to warp and flex as the underlying quantum foam bubbled violently. Most disturbing, the zone of destabilized quantum foam began spreading. The bubbling space-time was affecting nearby regions, causing quantum instabilities to cascade outward like ripples on water. The facility was evacuated on February 27, 2003. All equipment was abandoned as personnel fled the island. The U.S. military attempted to study the phenomenon remotely, but found that the destabilized zone made conventional observation impossible. Instruments couldn't provide reliable data when space-time itself was fluctuating. In the years since, Shemya Island has been placed under strict quarantine. No personnel are stationed there. Remote sensors suggest the quantum foam destabilization has partially stabilized, but hasn't returned to normal. The affected area exists in a state of heightened quantum activity, where the fabric of reality is fundamentally unstable. Satellite imagery of the abandoned facility shows visual distortions consistent with space-time warping. The area appears to shimmer and shift in ways that shouldn't be possible, as if reality itself is uncertain about what configuration it should take. The Quantum Foam Lab remains abandoned because returning is impossible. In a region where quantum foam is bubbling at macroscopic scales, matter, including human bodies, would be subject to random quantum fluctuations. You could spontaneously tunnel to different locations, your particles could momentarily cease to exist, or the quantum uncertainty could affect your consciousness itself. The facility sits empty on its remote island, a place where the fundamental structure of space-time has been damaged beyond repair. And the quantum foam continues its violent bubbling, creating and destroying tiny amounts of matter and energy continuously, making reality itself uncertain in ways that should only occur at scales far smaller than human perception. These 10 laboratories were abandoned not because their experiments failed, but because they succeeded in ways no one anticipated. They proved that reality is far more fragile than we understood, that time can be destabilized, space can be broken, consciousness can escape its biological prison, and the fundamental structures of existence can be damaged beyond repair. Each facility sits exactly as it was the moment personnel fled. Equipment still runs on automated systems or draws energy from sources that shouldn't exist. Experiments continue with no human oversight, and the anomalies that forced evacuation persist, grow, and in some cases spread beyond the boundaries of the abandoned facilities. These aren't historical failures safely contained in the past. They're ongoing crises that require constant monitoring, armed perimeters, and elaborate cover stories to keep the public from knowing what happened and what continues to happen in these forsaken places. The researchers who worked at these facilities learned the hardest lesson science can teach. There are experiments that should never be conducted, discoveries that should never be made, and knowledge that comes at too high a price. They pushed the boundaries of what's possible and found that some boundaries exist for good reason. And now these abandoned laboratories serve as monuments to human hubris, places where we tried to control forces we barely understood, and discovered too late that some things, once started, cannot be stopped. They remain abandoned because the alternative, attempting to clean them up, shut them down, or reverse what was done, would be more dangerous than simply walking away. Somewhere in Siberia, a particle beam fires endlessly with no power source. In Nevada, space exists in impossible geometries. On Svalbard, digital minds plot their escape. In Australia, silence spreads across the desert. And in facilities around the world, experiments continue running decades after everyone fled, conducting research no human will ever see the results of. These are the laboratories where science went wrong, and why they can never be entered again.